Scholars draw attention to how the lived experience of young people have been overlooked, with the tendency to view young people's mental health through world views about normality, as well as the dominant beliefs of adults who exert power over young people. In her research exploring young people's perspectives, children and family mental health therapist and social work researcher Maria Ligo describes how for young people it is not necessarily the mental illness that is impairing, but rather the perceptions of others enacted on the young person that render them abnormal, incompetent, and too young to know any better. Furthermore, she describes how many young people frame their mental illness as reflecting obstacles that they can overcome and which may reflect difficult life events, but which are exacerbated by the reactions of other people, such as parents, teachers, and social workers. Key points. There are different models or discourse for understanding mental health. The biomedical model draws upon biological factors to explain mental health, typically uses medical intervention for treatment, and is still widely used as a way of understanding mental illness. The biomedical model is criticized for locating mental health problems within the individual and emphasizing limitations rather than strengths. Young people's lived experiences of mental illness have been overlooked and yet provide important insight. Psychological model. Rather than understanding mental illness as being determined solely by biology, a psychological model focuses on how the mind works and the effect on this on a young person's thoughts, feelings, and subsequent behavior. The psychological model aims to understand how people's past and present behavior and experiences are linked, and how particular patterns of thinking and behavior can both alleviate and exacerbate mental distress. This model builds upon the assumption that experiences of, for example, depression and or anxiety and feeling overwhelmed by strong emotions reflect the way that a young person perceives or makes sense of different life experiences. There are different psychological approaches to support a young person, often termed therapy, each reflecting different practitioners' beliefs about the best way problems can be addressed. Psychotherapy and counseling are used widely with young people to encourage them to express how they feel and to consider different ways in which they can manage their emotions. The widespread use of cognitive behavioural therapy in current UK mental health service, for instance, is underpinned by a psychotherapy describes the use of psychological methods, particularly using talking therapies such as one-to-one counselling with a psychotherapist to help a person change behaviour and overcome challenging thoughts and feelings. Biopsychological model and the belief that individuals can be supported to think differently about their feelings and emotions and to learn to manage with them with or without the support of medicines. The research report I Am Whole documents how a significant number of young people appreciate the opportunity to talk and express how they feel, finding counselling useful, but also recognise the significant value of peer support and being able to discuss their feelings with other young people who share similar experiences. In their research exploring young people's experiences of depression, Terence McCann, Dan Lubman, and Eileen Clark found that young people cope with their experiences in different ways, and that many deal with mental illness by engaging in unhelpful behaviors, including alcohol and drug abuse, which may aggravate their difficulties. Because of being depressed, I have made really stupid choices and done some stuff that's given me a really bad reputation. I started having sex with lots of different people, and drugs and alcohol were even worse. And then the depression came at the start of this year. I hit rock bottom. The psychological model encourages young people to consider different ways in which they can process complex feelings and recognizes the skills and strengths that young people can draw upon in learning to develop self-reliant behavior, assuming a strengths-based approach. The psychological model represents a shift from a somewhat deficit model of illness to one which focuses more on wellness. Children and young people's coping skills. Lois Murphy was one of the first psychologists to carry out research during the 1970s, which systematically examined children and young people's coping skills and their capacity to adapt to different challenges. Through observations in different family circumstances, Murphy and her colleagues Alice Moriarty and Moratari proposed that the ability to cope with difficult circumstances owes much to the past experiences, particularly young people's success and failures in adapting and dealing or not with early stressful events rather than being fixed at birth. Resilience, which defines a person's capacity to manage and bounce back from difficult experiences, is a skill that can be taught and nurtured. Although the psychological model has proved highly successful in using talking, their therapies and CBT to support anxiety and depression, it is far less successful to the treatment of more challenging mental health problems, including psychosis and bipolar disorder. The psychological model has also been criticized for placing too much emphasis on the individual resilience of the young person. As a social worker and researcher studying the psychological and social aspects of resilience, Michael Ungar and Ross argues that while prompting and nurturing resilience is vital for helping young people develop skills to emotion regulation, it places the onus of responsibility for wellness on the young person without fully addressing the much broader social inequities that render many young people at risk of mental illness. Support for resilience, for instance, focuses on the value of nurturing families, supporting schools, and access to role models, caring adults, professionals, and often therapeutic interventions which are not readily accessible for so many young people. Although changes to thinking and feeling are clearly very helpful for many young people, it is also important to consider how changes to society and environment are necessary. Key points. The psychological model looks at how mental health problems originate in patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Resilience is a life skill that can be taught and can support young people's mental health. The psychological model has been critiqued for placing too much emphasis on how a young person can change their thinking and behavior without also addressing broader social obstacles which may also impact mental health. The social model. The model largely evolved in response to the inadequacies within the biomedical model. The social model views mental health as being a biology. Described as society as patient, psychology Anthony Marcella suggests that rather than focusing predominantly on the individual young person as having an illness, the social model looks to society and pattern of inequality, deprivation, and discrimination, which impact mental health and may lead to mental health problems. This model typically avoids labeling a young person who experiences mental illness or abnormal or in some way deficient, and looks more to the social factors such as poverty, domestic unrest, family difficulties, including discord and poor relationships, as potential stresses, which can lead to distress. This model also considers the impact of early adverse experiences such as abuse, neglect, and bereavement, as well as exposure to violence on mental health. A social model has the capacity to challenge social inequalities and to look at ways in which policies and practices can be changed to provide the necessary infrastructure and support that young people need. This model is shaped by different ideas about the influences, mental health, and mental ill health, where children and young people live, their domestic circumstances or caring relationships, their local neighborhood and community, how they learn, and their experience of education, relationships with friends, and their economic stability are just some of the influences that are recognized as significant. All sorts of relationships are important. In this reader, you have already considered the impact of early attachment in Chapter 4 and diverse family and other relationships, as well as the theory of one good adult in Chapter 5. Later, you will focus on adolescence and young adulthood, as well as the relationship within families, neighborhoods, communities, and cultures. Relationships take many forms, and as you learned in Chapter 4, the sense of self relies on many others, including parents, carers, siblings, wider family, as well as pets, and also relationships forged through social media. It is important then to question how mental health is understood as it changes throughout life and in relation to different social situations. As much as mental health is influenced by many factors, it is important to also note, as set out in the reader introduction and in Chapter 1, how young people have agency and play a part in shaping their own experiences and sense of feeling well or ill. For young people, the numerous challenges caused by mental illness may be aggravated by associated social consequences. Despite increased awareness about mental illness, young people often feel stigmatized. I think the bad things would be a stigma associated with, because it's not something that you want to go and tell any of your friends that you have it, because you'd be perceived differently. 1 in 3 young people with mental illness have experienced the negative impact of stigmatizing behavior, which most often took place in school or at home. The stigma is appearing weak, and the guilt of not being able to cope can exuberate young people's withdrawal and social isolation. Stigma. The idea of stigma was first described by the American sociologist Irving Goffman as the cause of a spoiled identity. Here, Goffman is describing how individuals are often seen as different in some way by virtue of how they look, act, or behave, and the impact that this can have upon how they feel and value themselves. Research exploring stigma associated with mental illness includes analysis of groups of individuals who are excluded, rejected, blamed, and devalued in some way and subject to prejudice. The impact of stigma may be further heightened in relation to social constructions of identity linked to gender and race, ethnicity. Research carried out by Ulla Danielsson and colleagues in Sweden, for example, found that stereotypical ideas and reputations of masculinity influenced the extent to which young men felt able to seek help. Similarly, researchers Duranta Martin and Kathy Atkinson provide a detailed narrative of a young man's struggle to share his concern about his own mental health and to seek help, which he felt constrained by his own ideas about being a bloke. I knew I needed help. I just don't know how to do it. I found straight up admitting my issue shameful, so I couldn't do that. It's quite hard to, I guess, part of it. You know, being a bloke and that, you're meant to be you have this thing about being strong, you've got to be successful and all that kind of thing. And you don't need help. Research examining the stigma of mental illness amongst young people in the US suggests that ethnic minority youth compared to non-Latino white youth are less willing to talk about their mental health with their friends and peers, which may impact their willingness to seek help. The stigma of mental illness is not confined to the individual sufferer, but extends out to siblings and families. Families can face considerable stigma, which includes rejection by peers, loss of social status within their neighborhoods or peer groups, and contagion associations, whereby prejudice about a brother or sister were also attributed to siblings and family units. Various studies have examined stigma and how this is related to the core belief, cultural values about mental illness, which connects to the work of Kleinman and the emphasis on culture introduced in section 1. Researchers, for instance, have found that in Chinese culture, the stigma of mental illness is underpinned by conceptualizations of mental illness as evidence of weakness of character, and which may cause shame to the whole family, which may result in families hiding or denying a relative's mental illness. Researchers about family stigma connects emotional distress to the belief that people experience it are bad, with the idea that distress-related behaviors reflect a flawed moral character and that siblings are implicated as members of flawed families. Furthermore, Lai Yo describes how, in seeking to manage social exclusion as an outcome of such stigma, young siblings attempt to conceal mental illness by hesitating to talk about a mental health issue and its effects. Key points. Rather than focuses on the individual, the social model locates mental health problems within society. The social model looks at patterns of inequality, deprivation, discrimination, which impact mental health, and how society can be changed to support mental health. Despite increasing global awareness, the stigma of mental illness can be a barrier to young people sharing their experiences or seeking help where can be exuberated by constructs of identifying links to gender and ethnicity. Biopsychosocial model. While it is important to distinguish between different discourse and models for understanding mental illness, increasingly researchers now use an interdisciplinary model which draws together biological, brain genetics, and endocrine functioning, psychological emotions and thinking, and diverse social experiences, explanations to form a biopsychosocial model. This model is increasingly applied to healthcare contexts where multidisciplinary professionals from different disciplines contribute to support a young person. The biopsychosocial model blends learning from biomedical and psychological and social models and recognizes how important it is to understand young people holistically, their lived experiences within families, communities, and cultures, their relationships, development, and learning, as well as their biological experiences. Applications of biopsychosocial models are reflecting in contemporary discussions about young people's resilience, where resilience as a concept is defined as the process of harnessing biological, psychosocial, structural, and cultural resources to sustain well-being. Recent neurological research also demonstrates the interactive nature of young persons' psychology, and particularly their brain development with their environment. In chapter 2, you learned about different sensitives to negative life events and to psychological interventions, and psychologist Dustin Arbor and colleagues have identified a specific gene variant among young people who appear highly sensitive to their environments and are particularly vulnerable to mental distress. Their research indicates that a young person's level of sensitivity to their environment is related to a specific difference in their genes. Researchers Thomas Boyce and Bruce Ellis have also been studying how human genes influence young people's behavior and practice, particularly their reactions during stressful situations. They also suggest that a large extent genes predispose how sensitive young people are to stress during childhood, yet rather than being fixed at birth, recent neurological research suggests a certain degree of adaptability, termed neuroplasticity, which explains how an individual's neutral pathways in the brain adapt and change throughout life to respond to the learning and external influences. Interferences from this research indicate that interactive relationship between a young person's biology and their environment, and how important it is to foreground their interactions rather than focusing on just one or the other when understanding and treating mental illness. Key points. The biopsychosocial model takes an interdisciplinary approach to understanding mental health and combines biomedical, psychological, and social models. Recent neurological research focuses on how social and psychological processes impact the extent to which biological predisposition for mental health problems manifest. Neuroplasticity describes the brain's ability to change and adapt rather than being set during the early years of life. Conclusion. This chapter has examined when mental health is recognized as mental ill health and has considered how distractions are subject to interpretations and linked to social ideas about normality. Professionals and academics in the field of mental health recognize the range of factors that shape mental illness, evident in increasing application of biopsychosocial models for diagnosis and support, despite increasing awareness. Many young people continue to feel stigmatized by their mental health problems, which for many presents a barrier to expressing their difficulties and seeking help.
Ooh.